Okay, testing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8.
Absolutely, you're right in there, and the red lights are flashing and everything. So
Fantastic.
yeah, I can hear you good
I
and
am
loud
about
here.
to be recorded for posterity.
You are, or whatever. You can hear the water in the swimming pool and the kids and everything.
Really?
Yep. This is an interview. This is an interview with Peter Jacobs. The date is July 17th, 1994, and we're located in Montreal at the lovely Mount Royal Tennis Club.
All right.
What a nice place to do an interview.
Recently renovated by yours truly
Oh, was it?
at a
Oh.
large fee, for a very large fee.
Yes, called free.
Yeah.
I better not comment on any of the plantings.
You got it.
I'll try not to.
Except that I put in a bunch of herbs
Oh, did you? Good.
in these containers,
Uh-huh.
and the cook is using them.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, that's good.
And apple trees, so kids can grow up in the city and
know what an apple tree is.
know what an apple tree is.
Good for you. Isn't it lovely? Well, it is a pleasant spot. It's almost too nice to be doing any work, I think.
Okay.
Thank you very much for taking time to talk with me today, Peter. I'd like to begin, if we could, with some early background information on you. Where were you born?
I was born in Montreal
Uh-huh.
in apparently one of the coldest winters on record. So cold that my mother said that they had to put blankets on the wall
My goodness.
in the nursery where I was staying. Right at the beginning of the Second World War, 1939.
1939, and the actual birth date?
3rd of December.
And so you went to school here. This is where you did your early training.
Yeah, I went to right through high school, and then after high school, I was quite definite about not going to McGill, which I thought would be nothing other than a continuation of what I had gone through. So I went to college called Antioch College, which at that point had two very interesting aspects. One was it was a work and study program, and the other one was that it was run on the honor system. And one of the things that I had objected to for a long, long time was having all sorts of people assume you were going to cheat. And this school operated on the premise that if you were in college, you would behave honorably, and it worked. The work and study program was also extremely interesting. I worked as a meteorologist on top of Mount Washington, and as a copy boy and a book reviewer on a newspaper, and as an audiovisual expert type of person in another work experience. And I worked also as an engineer and as an architect.
Where is Antioch?
It's in Ohio,
in
Yellow Springs, Ohio. It was, and probably still is, probably the most left-leaning of the small colleges in the States. It's extremely liberal.
And this was a general arts program?
I got a Bachelor of Engineering and Creative Arts.
Isn't that an interesting combination? That should generate a very interesting individual.
And in the fourth year it took me 5 years to get the joint degree, but in the fourth year, I went to MIT and studied architecture. Instead of sort of going to Europe, I went to MIT. And then I came back and I graduated, and then I went to Harvard, where I got a Master's of Architecture degree. And then I worked with
they all sound like you're standing
I know. Then I worked in Winnipeg and St. John's, Newfoundland, on a number of planning and design projects, and then went back to Harvard and got a Master's in Landscape Architecture.
Oh, did you? What year was the Master's of Architecture degree?
Was in 1964. And the Master of Landscape Architecture was in 1968. And
what made you do that? Why did you go into landscape architecture after architecture?
Well, it's an interesting but very simple story. When I was at Harvard, the competition amongst the architectural students and the egotism that was involved was mind-boggling. I then worked in a very good architectural firm in Montreal for Affleck, Deborah Dimakopoulos on Expo 67. She's a little bit off the wall, actually. You know who she is. And while I was at Harvard, I spent a lot of time in the basement where the landscape architects were, talking with people who were studying there at the time and going to a lot of their crits. And I really just decided that that was much more interesting to me. And even when I was in architecture, I was already leaning in that direction. Then when I worked for Expo 67, there was a lot of site planning and design involved with the pavilions. I got involved with a lot of that. Then I went to Winnipeg, as I said, and I worked on a city planning project for a village in the Avalon Peninsula of Newfoundland, which again was more large-scale planning than it was architectural projects. And just before I went back to Harvard, I worked with an architectural firm, Liebling Michener, at the time, on a very complicated technical high school, in which I went back to doing, integrating structures and mechanical and all that sort of stuff, which I was pretty good at, but which I didn't interest me at all. I applied for a job with Cam Mann and didn't get it.
With Man Taylor?
Yeah. And about a month later, found myself in the very interesting position of being responsible for coordinating their work in the architectural office that I was working in. And I must say I enjoyed that very much.
The feeling of power.
Well, it was sort of, there was an ironic sense of not justice, but of having really tried to switch professionally. When I went back to Harvard, of course, there was no problem. And then right after that, I taught at Nova Scotia Technical College. And there, although I was responsible for introducing landscape architecture, it was essentially an engineering school. And I taught a number of graduate engineering courses in water resource management and a range of other things that were related to Ian McCarg's approach to regional landscape planning, but also Carl Steinitz that I had studied with. And a lot of the methodologies, frankly, were in the process of evolving, and we contributed a lot to them. It was, Carl had not yet established a real school, and the students, I think at that point, at the early part of the regional planning at Harvard, really had a great deal of input.
Who were some of the people that you did work with at Harvard, both in the architecture program and in the landscape architecture?
Well, I was very fortunate. I have had some really superb teachers. At MIT, I worked with Maurice Smith, Albert Bush Brown, and Belushi. At Harvard, all of whom were, well, Albert Bush Brown was an architectural historian. The other two were very good architects. At Harvard, I worked with Jerzy Zoltan, Jose Luis Sert, Fumihiko Maki.
Definitely international.
It was very international. Fumihiko Maki was he's a very, very successful Japanese architect who, when he was at Harvard, spoke exactly no words of English. And the teaching that he did was that he would come into the studio, sit down at your desk, and instead of talking, he would draw with you. He knew what the project was because he had said it, but he basically communicated through the end of a pencil. And I must say that it was one of the better learning experiences that I've had, because there was no room for verbiage. There just wasn't any verbal. And it was quite interesting. And he seemed to be able to communicate with just about everybody in that way. There were, gosh, any number. Aldo van Eyck was another one that I remember very, very well. But I guess, even though I'm a professor, I would have to admit that I probably learned a lot more from my colleagues than from my professors. I didn't learn a lot more. I learned differently. And the colleagues that I had in school were highly motivated, self-motivated. Some of them were quite idealistic. And at that point in the mid-60s, there was a lot of idealism, a lot of social concern, social philosophy. My master's project was on a psychiatric hospital in Montreal based on the pavilion philosophy of family units, which I developed with a psychiatrist in Montreal as a kind of a model or a prototype of how you could deinstitutionalize psychiatric care. And it wasn't the normal kind of stadium or whatever you would do, but I was not the only one doing that kind of project. There were others doing social housing and other people with other kinds of social concerns that were developing projects that frankly were quite interesting. The project that I did develop, curiously enough, was implemented in Cincinnati. And well, it's not that curious. The doctor that I was working with in Montreal moved to Cincinnati and actually got a comparable type of an idea started there.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
And what were some of the basic philosophical approaches of the school at that time, both in the architecture program as well as in the landscape architecture program?
They were radically different.
In architecture and landscape
yes,
architecture?
Yeah. I forgot to say that, of course, the major teacher that I had in landscape architecture was Suzaki.
Yep.
But I also studied with Chuck Harris and Carl Steinitz. And with Walter Izard, who was a regional scientist. So between the two and the undergraduate education, which was by far the most powerful, I mean, by far, I got quite a broad array of perspectives. The philosophy in architecture at Harvard was elitist. You learn to be important. It was the antithesis of everything that my undergraduate education has taught me. And yet, strangely enough, the professors, Jerzy Zoltan amongst them, who was a member of the CIAM, and a good friend of Corbusier's, at the Congrès International d'Architecture Mondiale, or something equivalent to that. It was the International Architectural Association that was largely headed by Corbusier and afterwards by José Louis Sert. And Zoltan was a member of Team 10, I believe, as was Aldo van Eyck. And their philosophy was very social. Housing after the war. Aldo van Eyck at that point had designed an orphanage, which was really very impressive. Impressive for the thinking behind it as much as for the physical form. So that on the one hand, the teachers really were motivated by a strong social conscience and a strong social commitment. And the school itself was unbelievably elite, to the point where, frankly, it was not coherent. Landscape architecture was quite different. The international style was the motivating force behind architecture, or Corbu in particular. And site planning, etc., was more or less irrelevant. the context didn't matter as much as the product. And quite a number of us at that point were much more interested in the context. And I remember actually one project where it was an electronics plant that we were asked to design with parking for, I don't know, 5,000 cars or something like that. I took one look at what 5,000 cars meant, and I developed a scenario where I was going to take the land, make an outdoor movie theater, use the parking at night for the outdoor movie theater and the day for the parking for the employees, and through this process save a whole bunch of money and also a whole bunch of space. And the architectural professors basically didn't know how to cope with it, because at that time you simply took the program and did it, and there was no such thing as messing around with the program. I think in landscape architecture it was quite a bit different. First of all, Ian McHarg had made his mark on the profession. The scale of regional planning was now assumed to be a legitimate area of concern. When I was in architecture, looking at landscape architects at the undergraduate level, in the basement, they were very much involved with site planning, period. It was, and they were doing just great work, but it was site planning. Whether it was an airport or a hospital or a housing thing, it was very much where the practice was centered. Regional planning was much more a product of 10 years thereafter or whatever. And I was fortunate enough to be able to study site planning with Suzuki and start regional planning with Carl Steinitz and learn about the philosophy of education from Chuck Harris. So it was a very good background. And then immediately thereafter, I started teaching at Nova Scotia Technical College, which is now called, I think, TUNS, the Technical University of Nova Scotia or something like that. And so by the time I did that, I was closing the circle with the engineering that I had to begin with, the regional planning, the architecture, and the landscape architecture, and it worked out very well.
When you were teaching at Nova Scotia Tech, was that based on the course? What did you use for a curriculum?
I invented the whole thing.
But based on what you had been studying?
Based on quite a bit of what I had been studying, but what I've been studying over the past 10 years, rather than just taking the curriculum from the master's program of landscape architecture and applying it, because it wasn't applicable.
Why wasn't it applicable?
Well, the state of site planning, the state of concern for landscape itself was very primitive. There may have been 2 landscape architects in the whole province.
And this is what year?
1969.
Okay.
I gave a lot of continuing education courses. Was very active in the environmental movement. Worked a lot with biologists, ecologists, marine scientists on a whole range of issues that were of concern to the area, and developed on a basis of a Canada Council grant a strategy for the use of the 2 watersheds adjacent to Halifax that had been preserved up to then for water supply, but which were gradually going to be released, and saw that as an opportunity of avoiding urban sprawl, etc., and developed a project which is to a certain extent being implemented slowly over the years. There was also a very interesting...
That was just a theoretical...
Well, it was a theoretical, but with a design proposal assigned to it that was schematic, but where all of the resource analysis had been done, where the watersheds were fully documented, where the urban open space system that I was proposing was really a kind of a network within which different housing communities could be developed. And it was the first time, I think, that in that region there was an integrated and strategic approach to landscape planning and landscape use. At that time as well in Halifax, there was a very interesting experiment which was called the Metropolitan Area Regional Planning, MAPC, Metropolitan Area Planning Commission. And it was a metropolitan-wide approach, strategic approach to planning, and I was responsible for the recreational component in there. And so I had an opportunity to expand beyond the watersheds to the entire region. And we developed essentially a strategy for urban open space, parks and conservation, various other things, which in fact has been implemented.
The watersheds project, was there any other work being done in Canada along that line, that there was policies?
Not that I know of. No, I think it was quite amazing. Just to give you an order of magnitude, and I only found this out later, I applied for a Canada Council grant, and I think I applied for something like $12,500. And that's what I got. I got $12,500, which was something like $4,000 more than any other research grant that had ever been awarded by the Canada. I mean, they thought it was an enormous amount of money. And at that time, I guess it really was. But just to give you an idea how figures have changed.
Were any of the policies that you developed in terms of how the watershed area should be preserved or used, were any of those policies adopted by any other place in Canada?
Well, one of the major sponsors was CMHC. But they didn't. It was funded by Canada Council, but a friend of mine subsequently from CMHC saw the process and thought it was really interesting, and tried to get it into the CMHC system, and I think was successful in doing so. So it had a ripple effect, primarily through CMHC and through another group, which was a developers group. I forget their name and association, but it was Canada-wide municipal development group or some such thing. And these were the developers, the people that really took large chunks of land, put them together and developed housing. And at that time, if I'm not mistaken, most of the large-scale housing tracts were being developed. And so the principals got involved in that way as well. Yeah.
But no one landscape architect or firm came to you and asked you for that information?
Not really, no. Although Peter Kleinstra, after many years, turned out, in fact, I worked with Peter for a while on some of the principles and some of the actual sites that we had dealt with previously.
Were you ever aware that any American organizations or groups were interested in the work?
Well, see, one of the things that I did, even while I was in Nova Scotia, was I always published what I was doing. So that particular project was published in a number of magazines, and I think did have some influence, but was also part of a general movement. So that it's hard to draw a hard line around it and say this was copied by that particular person. It was part of the way things were being thought of at the time, although a little bit at the leading edge of it.
And where did things go from there for you?
Well, then I was asked to come to Montreal to teach at the University of Montreal.
Oh,
and
right from Nova Scotia?
From Nova Scotia Tech, right. And that was in 1971.
Had the program been established?
No. Well, sort of, a little bit. Doug Harper was the first head of the program because it wasn't a department. It was a program within architecture at the University of Montreal. And I believe that program started around 1969. And then, if I'm not mistaken, by about 1972, it was made into a full-fledged degree with a department status. I believe so. If not, it was shortly thereafter. I was asked to come in to start graduate work, even though the undergraduate program hadn't really gone too far. And about a year or two after a year maybe, after I had started, I was asked to be the director of what would be the new department. I'm sorry I've forgotten the dates, but they're on my curriculum vitae. Okay. And I was the director of the department for about 7 or 8 years. A period where the department, like the association, went from really a very few people to, maybe 80 or 85 people in the program. We had a lot of graduate work going on, but not in what you would call landscape architecture in a sort of a constrained sense, but I had a lot of architects, a lot of lawyers, a lot of engineers, all of whom were interested in broadening their horizons. And they got a Master's of Applied Science. It wasn't a Master's of Landscape Architecture. For about 8 years thereafter, I was Associate Dean in charge of research at the university. And during that period, worked an awful lot with the Inuit in northern Quebec and with the IUCN, International Union for the Conservation of Nature and Natural Resources. Okay. Where I was chairman of a commission on environmental planning, which was a worldwide network of volunteer people. And I basically worked in Thailand, in the Gambia and Senegal, in Switzerland, France, a little bit in Japan, all over, usually for small, short periods of time. I spent quite a number of visits to Israel, all trying to put together programs of landscape conservation and use through this network.
And were you successful?
Yes. To be perfectly honest, there's the network that I established, and I was chairman of that commission for 12 years, which was a long time, too long. But the network has maintained itself quite well. It's a network of people that became very close friends. I think probably my closest friend not in Canada is in Zimbabwe, and my second closest friend is in India. And that's a kind of an experience that I wouldn't give up for anything. And IFLA actually is an extension of that. I became very interested in international networks, terribly uninterested in international associations. And I think that unfortunately all of the experience I had with the United Nations, with Habitat, with CETA, with all of the bureaucratic institutions has been largely negative insofar as it's unproductive. Whereas all of the contacts that I've had with people have been extremely positive, rewarding. Things tend to get done, usually with no resources whatsoever. And they also tend to stick because they get done by people who are there to continue to make sure that whatever they invested their time and energy in doesn't go down the drain. So there was a lot of that going on. The environmental impact assessment work that was going on with the Inuit was a product of the James Bay and Northern Quebec Agreement. We've used successfully the environmental impact analysis procedure to do planning. By one example I'll never forget was that we were requested to review a project to locate a water intake site in the, I can't do that. A water intake, yeah, okay, a water intake site in a location which we knew was going to be downstream from the sewage outlet. Now, this is a village of 140 people, and we said, look, this isn't the way to do it. We need to know where you're going to expand, this, that, and the other thing. And the Inuit themselves fully understood that what we were saying made sense. They took on the whole business of municipal planning and represented a project in which all of the pieces were coordinated and everything else. And then we said, now we can evaluate the water intake location. It's a very petty, small little example, but it's one of the few that I know of where you really used impact analysis to generate a planning approach. And we've been doing that quite a bit in the north, in northern Quebec. I think we've done it successfully because nobody pays any attention to us. We're marginal, out in the fringe. Nobody knows what the hell that environment's like. And so it's been very successful. That I've been involved with for 15 years. And we are accorded benign neglect with a great deal of positive feedback. We're now doing the Great Whale Project, which is a huge evaluation. The Great Whale Hydroelectric Project will be valued at something like $13 to $15 billion. And the commission that I'm chairing is evaluating it. And it's a massive piece of work, just massive. So it goes from water intake to, well, the value of that might be something like $20,000, or let's say $15,000 to $15 billion. It's quite a range. Now, as all of that was going on, gradually, after all of the international experience and the networking and everything else, I decided I wanted to get back into design. And with a young colleague of mine, we've begun to do quite a number of design projects, and Place Berry in downtown Montreal was the first of these major projects to be developed by us.
What year was that?
That was in 4 years ago, though. And we're now working on a project in Faubourg, Quebec, which is a new housing development beside the old city. And we're working on a second phase of Place Berry. And I think that by and large, and we're part of a team that's bidding, hopefully successfully, on the reorganization of the faculty of which I belong, a new building and everything else. So I would say that I'm getting more and more interested in going back to my design roots. And at the same time, at the university, I've become more and more interested, and I always have been, in the more theoretical aspects of landscape architecture. And a concern that I have that landscape architects seem to be very embarrassed about being intellectual, which I think is deadly. I really do. I think when you listen to a landscape architect defend his project, and you listen to an architect, an engineer, a lawyer, a doctor, it's just a huge difference. And I believe that one of the problems in our educational system in landscape architecture is that it is neither rigorous enough nor intellectual enough. And I don't care whose feelings I'm hurting. This is by no way to say that all of the professors in all of the departments of landscape architecture are idiots. They're not. But the curricula is far too professional, far too little focused on the intellectual constructs that support the profession. And consequently, the profession doesn't have any intellectual constructs. And I think this is totally unacceptable and contributes to the very real possibility that the profession won't exist. Because if it doesn't have a basis of arguing on its own behalf, then I don't see any way it can exist. The Ian McHarg phenomena is extremely interesting. It's now been totally taken over by city planners, geographers, engineers, etc. And what might have been an important focus of the profession is to a large extent a marginal one. There's a lot of business that goes on with that, but if you don't have the philosophy to support it, you're not gonna get it. I think that there's been a terrific amount of work done by landscape architects in renaturalization, in biological engineering, if you will, in terms of slope stabilization and everything else. This is largely seen now as engineering works. Occasionally there's a certain amount of biological consulting going on, but landscape architects are not that closely associated with it. A lot of the site planning and design, as everybody knows, is now being looked at with great greed by architects and others. So you've got horticulture, which used to be a very important part of landscape architecture, is now very much a part of the horticultural society. When you think of the profession, it's been a leader in a whole number of different domains, but can't seem to maintain its position in the various fields that it's developed. I believe a large part of that is because there just isn't a way that we have instilled in our students primarily to be able to argue the case on their own behalf.
And how can you do that? What are some of those
I think we have to go back to a much more rigorous understanding of history, and not in terms of kings and castles, but in terms of the constructs that have evolved, the ideologies, the theories, and the practice that have informed history. I think it's inconceivable that a landscape architect, wouldn't understand the economics of a particular historical period. How can you expect them to understand our current and future situation without having an understanding of that? So somehow or other, history has always been taught as that subject that deals with the past, that deals with styles, that deals with kings and castles, as I've said. But I'll be darned if I understand what the relevance of that is to a young practitioner who has to deal with the economics, the politics, the ideology, the sociology of a particular era. And that's not taught. Largely isn't taught. I think that landscape architects, by and large, tend not to read. And this is sometimes a badge of great pride. And I'm sorry. I think it's an overt admission of ignorance. I think that landscape architects are also, by and large, extremely willing to give everybody the benefit of the doubt. They're very warm amongst each other. Criticism is not a strong part of the profession. It's much too strong in architecture. But in between the two, there's a happy medium. And I think that the profession suffers from a lack of criticism.
What do you mean by criticism?
Well, when's the last time a project was built that somebody had something to say about in a way which didn't say, "Isn't that lovely?" or "Congratulations, you got a great project"? I mean, beyond the niceties of it won an award or it didn't win an award, what have we got to say about the project? is the idea of building 4 artificial ecosystems under a dome in an Olympic park a good idea or not? You know, well, everybody says, yeah, but the technique of the false rocks is really superb. And it may bloody well be. But is that the issue? Is that the issue?
And who are the people who should be making those comments?
I believe the professionals, as well as the equivalent of the architectural critics in landscape architecture, of which there are almost none. You know, and Ida Louise Huxtable in landscape architecture would go a hell of a long way. I think there's a certain arrogance in some of the architectural critics that was not evident with Ida Louise Huxtable and others of her level. The arrogance of, I know I'm a critic, which I don't think would be tolerated in landscape architecture. On the other hand, I think that there's been a kind of a refusal to even address the issue, which is probably just as bad. I think our meetings are usually focused, or have been in the past, on everybody else's expertise, not on our own, which is very nice because you get to listen to a poet and a storyteller and a historian and a geomorphologist, and it's great. I've always enjoyed that. But when it comes our turn to say what we're doing, it's pretty weak. And I think that's because we don't spend any time doing it, not because what we're doing is that weak. I think we're horrible publicists. I mean, just disastrously bad. A good project very seldom gets any kind of press, any kind of outward visibility. And I think that's our fault, because you've got to work on that. Now, all sorts of other professions do. We don't. We don't. And we don't, or if we do, we don't do it well enough. So
And again, who should be doing that? Where should that be coming from?
Well, I think any reasonable office should be concerned with making sure that people understand what good design is, what good planning is. And I don't think that I know of too many instances where interesting planning approaches or good site design has in fact been used to illustrate to the larger community what good is. Now, if you look at design in Italy, I mean, some of the landscape is so butchered, it's pathetic. But where you see good landscape design, it jumps out at you. Where you see good graphic design, good architectural design, good industrial design, it sings. I don't think we spend enough time making the effort to make sure that people understand what the difference is.
And I think that what you're saying too about the question of the future of the profession still being around, if the public in a very understandable fashion isn't given information about landscape architects and what they do,
why would they defend it?
Well, exactly, and they're not going to create the demand, and the profession is going to definitely suffer from it. That's a very critical point, isn't it?
So now, I think that's true. I think we then have to obviously make ourselves better known, convince the public that what we're doing is in fact viable. But to convince them that it's viable, you've got to have a story to tell. And if you don't have the intellectual background that will generate that story, then you can't. All you can do is say there are a bunch of functional requirements that we have fulfilled within the program and budget allowed to us, which is fine. But that's not going to make a profession.
No, and it's not going to bring converts.
No.
That's not going to, it's not going to continue to help make things grow.
Not even a little bit.
Not at all. That's absolutely right. I'd like to. Is there more you want to say on that at the moment? I'd like to actually go back several steps and maybe even several years here One of the things that you mentioned to me quite a few months ago when we were working on the brochure for the Society was the impact of Expo 67 on landscape architecture. You said that that was a very pivotal point in landscape architecture in Canada. Could you talk about that for a moment?
Well, I think that there were two situations that converged at that point. First of all, Canada was feeling very good about itself. There was a sense of optimism that we frankly haven't had since. And the optimism was pretty widespread. It's one of the few periods of time that I remember where the issue of doing it well, doing it right, was almost accepted by everyone. So that, yeah, and there was enough money in the economy to do it. But the commitment to excellence and to innovation was present. There was some pretty innovative engineering done to get the islands built. There were some extremely interesting transportation strategies, monorails and paths and everything else that were developed from a planning and urban planning point of view. And the fact of the matter was that there was a commitment to site planning and design on the islands precisely because they were green islands. So that green islands was like building a polder almost. It was a brand new set of opportunities attached to a historically important part of St. Helens Island. So you had island, which was St. Helens Island, and there was an attempt to link the two together. The Notre Dame Island was essentially brand new, and through it all, Expo attracted landscape architects, graphic designers, lighting designers, transportation designers from all over North America. And the sense of collegiality, the sense of optimism, the sense of search for excellence really occurred. It spawned certainly the School of Landscape Architecture at the University of Montreal. I believe it had an important role to play with Guelph and everything, Toronto and everything else. And I'm quite convinced that it was a seminal point that gave form to a lot of ideas, which a lot of people experienced. I mean, they were walking on the islands. They saw what it meant. And that gave a big impetus to landscape architecture because you were talking about something that people had actually seen. I think the problem today is that we don't have a continuing dialogue with the public on those issues.
Okay. Well, I'm sure that Expo 67 did do a lot. I wonder if it has really had any kind of continuing legacy. Do you think that there's been...
Well, interestingly enough, I got involved in the redesign of the Expo Islands because 15 years after Expo 67, they were in a pretty deplorable state. And for some reason or other, the Mayor Doré visited the islands, walked out of the metro stop, which is right in the middle of the islands, to the area which used to be part of the exhibition grounds, and was just bloody horrified. And so he launched a kind of a crisis of planning and design, which resulted in a renewal of the site, but for much more passive recreational activities. The site has been used for the Fleur-de-Lis, the international flower shows, and more recently it's been used as a place for the casino, the gambling establishment. The gambling establishment has turned out to be extremely successful, and they are now building, I think, 5,000 additional parking spaces, etc., much to the horror and, frankly, concern of people such as myself. I think that's really not the way to go. And so the legacy, in a way, has been renewed, but it's also been contradicted, if not ignored. In the city planning document, which is basically in practice now, the islands are to be conserved as recreational land, the exception being for the casino, for the Grand Prix that goes twice a year. There are a lot of big money generators that have proven to be over and above the law of the land. And the justification is that the Grand Prix brings in an enormous amount of money. I actually can live with that a little bit easier because it's only a week. And a week a year, well, I can live with that. But the casino is another story. It's another story.
So in terms of there being any kind of real long-term gain there?
Well, the long-term gain is significant additional recreational land. I think a general heightened awareness of what that's all about, 2 or 3 renewed attempts to interest the general Montreal public in horticulture and in a number of other associated activities. I still think that Montreal actually has a very positive relationship between the city and green spaces, with Mount Royal Mountain, which was another project that was renewed relatively recently. The islands, you've got 2 very important recreational resources right downtown. So I think the legacy was perhaps more diffuse than anything else, although, as I said, the site exists and is extremely well used now. Perhaps on a broader scale, the fact that the School of Landscape Architecture has undergraduate, graduate, and doctorate studies. It's one of the more broadly based landscape programs in North America.
How about for the rest of the country?
Expo?
Yes.
I think that its legacy is transferred largely to Toronto. I think things like the Metropolitan Zoo and then some of the urban planning downtown in Toronto are natural successors, if you will. Vancouver has done some very interesting work. I think that Expo may have been the first of about 3 or 4 phases of very positive, aggressive design innovation. And I think without it, you have no reference points. You have no way of saying this is good and this isn't so good. I think Expo did its job. I think it's continuing to do its job more on a provincial and metropolitan area than on a national scale. You know, and that's not surprising.
You just mentioned some of the other things that may have been affected and perhaps influenced by Expo. What are some of the other major projects in Canada that you think are significant examples of landscape architecture?
It's not an easy question. I think that project planning did some interesting housing work. I think the Metropolitan Zoo in Toronto was, at the time, a very innovative project. I think the courthouses in Vancouver was a very good attempt at urban integration, which in many respects is not successful. But apart from that fact that some of the relationship of the courthouses to the city network of streets is not that successful, certainly the attempt to introduce sort of living materials into an urban fabric is by and large very successful. I think that there was a lot of work done with the national parks system. and it's hard to say any one project is better than any other project, but I think landscape architects at one point were very much involved with the national park systems and did good work. I mean, there's no question about it in my mind. I think that we've done less of the historical and cultural work than we could have, but what we've done, we've tended to do pretty well. I like the projects that John Stewart used to be involved with, may still be involved with, in terms of the renovations of downtown towns, the Main Street program. I think we've done far less with environmental impact assessment than we could. But there again, I think that on occasion and in places, the profession has done pretty interesting work with impact assessment and landscape evaluation. It doesn't have to just be impact assessment. I think typically of Canada, there's no one project that sticks out miles above others. I think Bob Alsop has done some of the better urban design in the country. Is part of Detroit. I don't know whether to pronounce it in English or French, but I think he's from South Africa, if I'm not mistaken. But it's Roger Detroit and Hillier and Bob Alsop. And Bob has done some really superb site planning in an urban context. It's very urban. I think Michael Huff has done some very interesting work that's gone basically the gamut from the Scarborough College work that he did to reclaiming the Don River. I mean, it's quite a wide panoply of stuff that he's done, and I think that work is exemplary too. I think it's tragic that we don't have any collection of any of this stuff. And again, it speaks to the fact that why should we exist if we don't exist? And we're not going to exist if we don't exist in some permanent record. I mean, frankly, I don't know of any one of those projects that is available to a young student of landscape architecture except through architectural magazines. Okay? Scarborough College was published fully in architectural magazines. So were the courthouses. So was the zoo. So was Expo. Very little. I think it's a little bit sad that we don't have a magazine. And I think the argument that we're too small is an unacceptably superficial argument. It's just not true. Denmark has a fabulous magazine. They don't have anywhere near as many landscape architects as we do. Holland continually publishes stuff in book form, in video cassette form, and in journal form. There's just very little excuse for not doing more.
And without that kind of publicity, again, it's a very cyclical thing.
Yeah, it's a vicious circle. Yeah, that's right.
What do you think that up to this point in time, landscape architecture has done for Canada as a country?
I think we were, and may still be, very, very much at the center of the issue of sensitizing people to the quality of the environment in which they work and live, for which we've taken absolutely no credit. I think we're very much involved in issues of the importance of the natural systems of water, land, air, in supporting life, for which we have taken absolutely no credit. I think we have done some extremely good work in the urban design area, for which, again, we have taken very little collective credit. I think where we're weakest is in explaining why any of this matters, and in fact in saying that we've done it. There's probably a fourth area, which is the whole area of recreation. And I think there are two components. There's elite recreation, the villa with the huge swimming pool with the cabanas and all that sort of stuff. And then there's the national park, provincial park area where, again, I think landscape architects have done good work. There's a smaller clump of landscape architects who have done superb work in manuals about how to manage the landscape, for which not only have we not taken any credit, I'm willing to bet 9 landscape architects out of 10 don't know that it exists. You know, it wouldn't take very much for somebody to get really angry about how poorly we've done in this sector. So I think that the management sector is a future growth area, which, if history holds true, we're likely to develop and then lose.
Don't be such an optimist.
There's another way of looking at all of this, which is much more optimistic, and that is that basically 1,000 people isn't going to do anything anyway. So we might as well be at the leading edge, generating new things for other people to do with bigger bucks and more equipment and all this sort of stuff, and sort of be intellectual guerrillas, if you will, forging new paths and all this sort of stuff, and not worrying too much about the big corporate heavy machinery that has to back this up over the long term. I don't have any trouble with that idea at all, and I tried to do it most of my life. But I don't think it amounts to very much if you're not prepared to put it on record. And I think that one of the problems about putting things on record is that people might criticize what you're doing. And landscape architects just don't like that. Well, it's a hopeless generalization, but...
Why do you think that is? Why are they such nice people? And why don't they like to be criticized?
Well, I think part of it has to do with the fact that there's a certain humility that you had better acquire if you're working with plant materials, natural systems, because you don't have to be a rocket scientist to figure out that you're not in control. You know, you can nudge a little and you can sort of pat it up a little bit and hope like hell it stays where it's supposed to stay, but by and large you're not in control. So there is a level of humility, and I think it's a characteristic of the profession. I think the humility can be taken a little bit too far, and I think it is. I think it's equally true to say that in many sectors we do shape the environment, and we have to stand up and be counted for having done so. And a lot of that shaping is not necessarily bad. But to hide behind the fact that, well, you know, we didn't have a big enough budget or this, that, or the other thing, it doesn't wash. It doesn't wash.
Is there an, excuse me, is there an insecurity there too that?
Sure there is. Sure there is. There's an insecurity because many or most of the offices are small. They don't have the resources to do promotional work. They are living on a fairly tight string. But all of those things may be true, but there's a culture to all of this. And the culture is you don't put your work on the line. You do the work, you do it quietly. You try and establish the best linkages you can with the community and society, but you don't make a fuss.
I wonder if some of that, to me, there seems to be a real dichotomy in the profession, or even in the people in the profession, between the so-called environmental philosophy and the idea that perhaps in this case we're working with a, heavens forbid, a developer.
Mm-hmm.
And there seems to be this, as a landscape architect, I sense with a lot of people, they really want to be involved in the whole environmental program. And
Mm-hmm.
in fact, they're seen that way. They are seen as the protectors of the land, the protectors of the
Mm-hmm.
watersheds, the protectors of the trees. And then the public will come along and say, yeah, well, how can you protect the watershed when you're working for Joe Schmo, the developer?
Mm-hmm. Well, that's good. That's a good issue, because I think we've dragged this business of shepherds of the land around behind us far too long. I don't think it's true. I don't think it ever was true. I think that we got involved with a bunch of rhetoric, which we have then had to defend, and I'm not sure that it does anybody any good. I think that for a landscape architect not to be comfortable about development is a bit of a radical mistake. The profession is about change. It is about management of landscape change. Landscapes change because they're developed. They're not only developed by people, they're developed by natural systems as well. But the job is a management, design, and planning job. Now, if you want to be a conservationist in the strictest sense of the word, I'm not sure it's compatible with the profession. Now, if I say that, I'm going to be drummed out of God. I don't know how many. But I can say it quite comfortably. I've spent the vast majority of my life in various odd conservation groups in Canada, in Quebec, internationally, etc. And the story is always the same. If the object is simply to freeze it and say, don't touch, there may be a few regions in the world where this is, in fact, the best strategy of development. But to make this a guiding principle is nonsense. First of all, it isn't going to happen. Second of all, it's going to happen more poorly than if you got involved. And third of all, I'm not sure we shouldn't be developing landscapes. You print any of this, I'll deny all of it.
Yeah, but I've got it on tape.
Hey, tapes can be doctored too,
But I think one of the things that's interesting that you're saying is the fact that there is sort of a rhetoric that's part of that has been part of the profession. And that rhetoric has produced paradigms that have recreated themselves, and maybe that's what needs to change.
Well, I tell you that the Aldo Leopold's land ethic, if you read it carefully, is not an ethic against development. It's an ethic that says you must develop properly, and there are constraints on the development system. Well, we got involved in the 60s and 70s in a bunch of economic determinism that was mind-boggling. McHarg was an ecological determinist. He just played the other side of the coin and did it very well, and did it at a point where it had to be done. But surely, to goodness, we've grown beyond that. Or if not grown, we've changed, evolved beyond that. I think one of the problems that arises because of this lack of intellectual foundation, is that all of our intellectual foundations are either from other sources, Aldo Leopold being a good example, or from that sort of never-ending source of Frederick Law Olmsted. And with all due respect to the man, I can't imagine that he would be impressed with all this sort of repeated mantras in his name. It's I mean, surely to goodness, we must have something to say that is of our own making and which we're prepared to defend.
That was a fine base, but have we not moved beyond that?
Well, that base was anchored in a particular philosophy, a particular economy, particular social structure, which he understood and read very, very well and reacted to in ways which we all admire. But none of those variables are the same. And whereas we shouldn't ignore the historical example, we also shouldn't necessarily repeat it slavishly. So I think, we need more development. We need more intellectual development. I mean, hold on just a second.
I wonder, Peter, if you would mind talking a little bit about how you feel that the nature of the profession of landscape architecture has changed since you've been involved in it, or just your involvement in it professionally.
Well, I think the traditional base of landscape architecture, let's say in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, was definitely in site planning and design. Although there have been periods when landscape architecture was very involved with conservation. Public Works Authority program in the United States being a good example. Some of the landscape reclamation projects in Canada being another. But the core of the practice was basically landscape planning and design. I think the profession expanded its horizons significantly into regional planning and landscape evaluation in the late 60s and 70s. I think the environmental movement both created a lot of opportunities and quite a number of dilemmas in the profession. For some reason or other, the rhetoric of design and the rhetoric of environment seemed to be incompatible. So you had to choose a side to be on. I think that this was unfortunate, totally unnecessary, but nonetheless a very real fissure in the way in which the profession evolved. I think that the environmental groups got involved with a number of issues, including impact analysis and landscape evaluation, which was not seen to be particularly relevant to design. The designers got involved in land art movements and a range of other artistic endeavors, which didn't seem to be at all relevant to the environmental groups, and they simply grew apart. I think that more recently the whistle's been blown on this, and that a number of people, and I count myself amongst them, have basically said that emperor has no clothes. There is no dichotomy. This is a debate which never should have occurred, and there isn't the slightest reason in the world why landscape design has to be incompatible with environmental conservation concerns. In fact, I think there's a lot of very interesting work that is being done in which conservation is one of the generators of a design philosophy rather than being a constraint. And I think that we've become more comfortable with, more familiar with some of the aspects of landscape conservation that are important. We've integrated them, begun to integrate them into design. We've become energy efficient, conscious of energy efficiency. A number of the constraints of water usage, sewage disposal, a whole range of issues that were totally irrelevant to design initially have become part and parcel of the design vocabulary now. One designs with these conditions in mind. So I think that dilemma has gradually disappeared. I don't think the new generation of landscape architects will be anywhere near as preoccupied with the split as the previous generation has been. I think there's another shift that's going on that's terribly important, and that is the understanding that you cannot reduce design to a bunch of functional requirements. That the function of a project is very important, but there's a hell of a lot more to it than that. And the more to it than that, I believe, is telling a story. I think a design really has to deal with the layers of history in a way which is imaginative provokes a sense of belonging, attaches itself to a physical and cultural context, but does so in ways that are not necessarily literal.
Could you give an example?
Yeah, I'll give you a very good example. We're working on a project where the particular site that we're working on has a history that was both French, English, industrial, commercial, and then derelict. Certain ideologies would insist that we evoke the historical period of the French occupation. Other ideologies say the English was more important. And we say a plague on both your houses. That's not what we're interested in. History is a layered kind of series of events, and we have every right to add a layer to the layers that are there. It should be sensitive to, it should evoke, it should be aware of previous layers, but it doesn't have to freeze a particular period in time and say this was the most important period. Now, to evoke a sense of historical layers, you can't do so in a strictly functional manner. There has to be a poetic component to the proposal that you're making. In the particular case that we're dealing with, which is in the center of the city by the old city, just outside the ramparts, in what will become an urban court, we're proposing a birch forest, which in a very mineralized, hard-edged urban environment may in fact be just the kind of contrast which will help to evoke the fact that there was once a landscape here. And that's all there was. So the birch forest is totally unadorned, but through it, we've decided to recreate the ramparts, or the line of the ramparts, with laser light. At the height at which the ramparts used to exist. Now, we don't expect anybody to make that connection. They'll just see a birch forest with a number of lights going through it. And that's fine with us. You know, if eventually somebody said, what the hell are those lights doing there? Well, we can say, look, they represent a part of history that no longer exists. The hill that used to be there isn't anymore, and that explains why the damn things are up in the air. And on and on and on, and that's all. So it's a kind of a desire to add to the preoccupation with functional design a level of poetics which has, I believe, been missing for quite some time. That's it. That's it.
Okay. The initial question that you were working on was how the nature of the profession has changed, and maybe that is a good summation of how it has changed.
Well, I think that's why I brought it in, because I really believe that functional criteria animated not only landscape design, but architectural design, engineering design, and that role, that absolutely predominant role that functional requirements and economics and all of these factors played, is still there, but is no longer the sole source of a generator of form.
Do you think that sometimes that holding on to something like functional requirements, because to me when you say that, I think, yes, well, that's all well and good. It's nice to be able to say you're going to recreate or create a birch forest in this environment. But how about money? Where does that fit into this whole scheme? What about people who would like to do something like that, but they're told, well, you know, the budget says we need this, and this is what you have to accomplish?
Money either is a problem or an opportunity. I prefer to think of money as an opportunity, and a lack of it as a particularly important opportunity. Again, I go back to my basic underlying premise, which is if you don't have an intellectual basis for doing what you're doing, then you're caught. You're caught in repeating patterns that have already been established, knowing that these particular patterns cost a certain amount of money, recognizing that the budget that's available is not sufficient to satisfy that particular patterned response, and being in a situation where you're stuck. And then you complain a lot. Now, it is true that a number of particularly good projects do require money. I still maintain that you're never going to get that money if you can't argue on behalf of having it. If you can't explain that your particular approach or proposal is far more important than another possibility of using that money. Now, if landscape architects are constantly in a situation where they're getting what money is left over from the architectural project, you're going nowhere in a hurry. You've got to be up in front.
And how can landscape architects do that? I mean, that's assuming a whole new role, isn't it?
Well, I think it's not all that new. Sasaki did it. Sasaki always had his hands on the budget that he required to do landscape architecture, and frequently architects got less money. I'm exaggerating a little bit, but not too much. I believe that, well, in the work that we were doing and are doing in Montreal, we've made it perfectly clear that not only will we not subcontract to an architect, but we must have our own budget. And that budget, we're quite prepared to deal with it in a very honorable fashion, but we want nobody's percentage of no budget. I think if you can argue that the kind of project you're doing is independent, although associated with other architectural projects, you'll get the money. But you've got to be able to argue for it.
And again, that comes back to the intellectual
That's right.
base.
That's right.
Perhaps there might be those who would say that because you have a position at the university that pays a regular salary, that enables you to be able to say those kinds of things.
I think that's absolutely true. I wouldn't argue that for a second, and I think that puts a responsibility on academics to do two things. One is not to compete with their professional colleagues on jobs which the professional colleagues might be bidding on, so to avoid conflicts of interest, if you will, that way, and also to publicize and make available the results of that kind of applied research and design that they're doing. I think there's a definite responsibility. And if you wish, yeah, we might have a financial base that allows us to experiment, allows us to make the rules of the game more acceptable to landscape architects in general. And we have a responsibility to make sure that that's done. So I don't duck that responsibility at all. But I also am not prepared to say that that's the sole responsibility of academics. I think the professionals have got to bloody well do the same thing insofar as they can, as well as being teachers. I think that, it works both ways.
But I think that what you've said just now is that you can, as academics, you can play an important role in establishing new methods of work.
Absolutely.
And you've got the resources, the financial resources behind you, that if you don't get that project, it's not going to hurt you substantially financially. Right. But if you stick with your ideals, then at some point in time, perhaps, you will be able to change the way the whole profession works.
Well, I think that's true. And I think that in my own case, I've waited, 30 years for design work. And I don't regret it for a minute. I'm not bitter. I'm not upset or anything else. I wanted to do a certain kind of work, and now I can do it. Until I could do it, I did other things. But I think it would be false to focus it all on money and security. I've always believed that people that take risks, and the conditions don't matter. They're just risk takers. And people that generate new ideas just do, because that's the nature, that's in their nature. I think what we're not doing so successfully in school is providing students with the basis upon which they can take risks and generate new ideas. I think that we're unfortunately a little bit too conservative.
You mentioned a couple of times now that the projects that you're able to work on. What are some of those in any kind of detail that you'd like to give? And what are the principles of the design that you're now doing? What are your guiding ideas here? What are you able to do now that you haven't been able to do for 30 years?
Well, I think one of them is to have more control over the program and have more control over the way in which the project is or isn't integrated into the architectural and urban planning context. Most of the projects that were generated a while ago were done so with architects as the maître d'œuvre. They set out the ground rules, they set out the form, they set out this, that, and the other thing, and you were asked to plant inside of it. And that's just something that I never was prepared to do. And I'm still not. We've been fortunate enough to be able to get projects where we are the prime contractor. And that's what I think is important. It's also a big responsibility, because then you have to be responsible for what you've done. You can't blame it on anybody else. And I think that that's fair. I don't mind that. I think in terms of, what's the underlying philosophy of what we're involved with, certainly part of it is that we want very much to begin to think of the landscape in a much more comprehensive sense. In other words, rather than the greenery that is in the project, we're thinking of the urban landscape as just that, a landscape. And the way in which you intervene in a landscape is somewhat different than the way you rearrange the furniture in the inside of a room. And I think that we've been able, in a number of our things that we've written, a number of projects that we're beginning to develop, to accord to the activity of landscape planning and design an importance that it hasn't had until recently. I know that's fairly general, and in order to be much more specific, we'd have to look at specific projects and with the drawings and everything else. But fundamentally, I think it's just that we're prepared to assume a primary consultant role. We're prepared to work on the program as well as the actual design. And we're prepared to argue our case in documents that we call avant-projet, which is, preliminary proposals or something, but they're very developed in quite a bit of detail. And that's the way we're working with the City of Montreal. And so far, we've been able to argue our cases well enough to support the designs that we're proposing, so that the client truly understands what we're getting at. And even though it might look a little strange, there's a kind of an understanding of how it is composed, why it's composed that way, and the story that we're trying to tell.
And do you think that this is the direction for the future of landscape architecture?
No. Sorry, you're not going to get me that easy.
You got 2 minutes to tell me why.
I think the direction of landscape architecture is much more complex than that. I think there's going to be a terrific need for landscape management expertise at the large scale regional as much as the institutional. I mean, University of Toronto or the University of Montreal should have a landscape management plan, and they don't. And so should every other major institution. The same is true for parks, et cetera, et cetera. These things don't exist, and we could develop them. I think that design, in general, I think has to grow beyond the functional backstops that we've been using, and has to become more poetic, has to be able to tell stories that relate people to their biophysical and cultural contexts, and has to be, I believe, a little bit more aggressive in terms of claiming its place in the urban fabric, which generally I don't think we've been very good at. Now, all of this is subject to a huge caveat, which is if we're not prepared to articulate our ideas, the ideas aren't going to matter after a while. I think we've come pretty close to running our string of silence, and that very shortly we either have to speak up or leave the scene.
And do you think that is what will happen if landscape architects don't articulate themselves and their ideas?
Well, let's put it this way. I think that the risks of not speaking out and not articulating our ideas are far greater than otherwise. Yeah.
I think that sounds like a good place to.
Okay.